Welcome everyone to INTERFACEWARE's live Iguana webinar for April 2021, Logging and Queuing Best Practices. This topic is something many of you have requested additional information on, and we hope today's webinar is informative and will help you maximize your use of Iguana and have a deeper understanding on the business ROI of this specific function of Iguana. My name is Prashant Sri, and I'm the product marketing lead here at INTERFACEWARE. We're going to try and do something a bit different this session. We have two INTERFACEWARE staff members, Paul and Natalie, who will be on standby answering all your questions live throughout this webinar. So feel free to type any questions you may have in the Q&A box within your Zoom window, and either one of them will be answering those questions live today. The questions can be about today's presentation or about any Iguana related questions you may have. As we normally do, we'll be sending out a post-event recap email Monday morning, so look out for that in your inboxes with this recording and additional resources regarding Iguana logs. It is now my pleasure to welcome today's presenter, my colleague, and our speaker today, Aryn Wiebe. Aryn has been with INTERFACEWARE for over 3 years. She works as a solutions engineer and ensures Iguana is used in the best way possible to solve interoperability challenges for a variety of customers. She has a depth of understanding on all things Iguana related and is always ready to challenge herself. She is also a graduate of the University of Guelph with a Bachelor's of Engineering specializing in biomedical engineering. One interesting fact about Aryn is that she loves to play ice hockey outdoors. A true pleasure to welcome Aryn today.
All right, thanks Prashant for the intro. And thanks everyone for taking the time to join today's webinar. We're going to be focusing on Iguana's logging best practices, like Prashant had mentioned, but specifically around how you can best utilize your logs to optimize your Iguana instance performance, its reliability, enhance your security over your logs, as well as go over some key day-to-day workflows around monitoring, troubleshooting, and reporting, and how the logs play a role. So as a quick overview before we actually jump into the webinar, the first portion, I'm going to be walking through some key concepts around the logs, just looking at what the Iguana logs are and how they should be maintained and optimized for reliability, and also review key logging workflows and how they play a role in enabling you to perform robust monitoring, troubleshooting, and reporting. And also how and why you can use the Iguana Log API to programmatically query your log messages. Then we're going to finish it off with opening up Iguana and diving into a couple different exercises around troubleshooting your messages, and as well using that log API to query messages from your logs and gain insight into that data. So what are the Iguana logs? Well, each Iguana instance is going to use a single message queue to log all system and data messages, providing you with that complete chronological history of all of the events and interactions with Iguana, and essentially giving you that behind the scenes look at your Iguana instance and your interfaces. So you can see here that each log message is timestamped and contains a detailed informational log message with the source of the log and or the source of the log, which can be a Iguana service or a specific channel. And these logs are going to give you information and insight into all of your transactions and acknowledgements, information about the server and the Iguana service, information at the user level, looking at user activity like logging in and logging out of Iguana, or making any users that are making configuration changes to particular channels or to the Iguana instance settings. And also you'll get information on the channel level, looking at channel processing, activity, and status. But to record this different type of information, there are various types of log messages that Iguana will use. So Iguana will create message logs, which are going to contain all transactions that are sent through the server, whether it's an HL7 message, X12, JSON, or Fire resource, for example. But you'll also see all of your acknowledgements or your ACK messages that are going to be generated either by an external system or by Iguana in response to receiving a message. Iguana is also going to log error messages, and these could be service-related errors, channel-related errors, as well as any processing errors. But sometimes you'll also see warnings, and these are similar to an error, but they aren't as final. For example, maybe a connection has occurred and Iguana will send a warning message telling you that it's going to retry making that connection and retry sending those messages in a few seconds. But you'll also have success messages. So Iguana will indicate whether it has processed a message successfully or not. And to inform you of all of the different tasks that are going to be performed by and on the server, Iguana also is going to contain informational logs. And these give you insight into that service information, any Iguana or interface configuration changes, channel activities like starting and stopping, as well as that user activity and interaction with Iguana. So these logs are really going to give you the most insight into Iguana at the instance level, the interface level, as well as the user level. But you can also find debug logs, and these are internal debugging log entries that are more frequent and detailed, and they're going to be produced for a particular channel when you set that channel to a debug channel level or channel logging level. These are extremely useful for when you need to do any testing on an interface for performance, for example, or get more granular insight into tracking, for example, your SQL statements when you're interacting with a database. And lastly, a new message type for version 6.1 and above with Iguana Professional and Enterprise, we also will see audit logs. So anytime a user views, searches, or exports a log message containing ePHI, Iguana is going to create this audit log. So you can use these audit logs to trace your user access regularly, either through Iguana or through exporting them to external privacy information and event management systems. But we'll look at a few examples later on of how to export any of these log message types through Iguana. So now that we also know the main types of logs and the valuable information that they hold, let's quickly go over and understand how they should be stored and maintained to optimize Iguana's reliability and also resiliency and securing this patient data. Iguana, as well as making sure that this data is protected. So Iguana stores all of its queue and log information as daily log files in a designated directory that you specify. When you perform a quick install of Iguana, the default settings here are in this image, and essentially Iguana will create a log directory within your working directory that holds all of your configurations and your application files, and also assign a maximum log age of 60 days and a log purge time of midnight. But like we mentioned with the audit logs, your log messages can contain sensitive patient information. So it's really important to make sure that this data at rest inside of your log directory is protected. And this you can take a few different approaches to protecting your data at rest. There are methods within Iguana, like your user level or user access and controls, as well as there on the operating system level, you could have OS level restrictions and permissions directly on the log directory, as well as you could use methods like disk encryption, for example. But with Iguana Professional and Enterprise, you do have that option of enabling audit logs. You can see on the last setting in the log settings image there, you can enable this audit logging to produce those ePHI audit logs so that if you need to, you can trace back in the future. But as well, all of those log messages that are going to be written to the log directory are going to be natively encrypted through Iguana, adding that extra layer of security over your sensitive log messages and helping you meet those regulatory guidelines. But it's also important to remember that these are default settings, and every Iguana implementation is going to vary to meet your either technical integration needs or your business objectives. So it's important to optimize your Iguana's performance and resiliency through understanding just the general log configuration and maintenance best practices. So we do recommend that you modify your log configurations to meet your different needs and follow just our general guidelines that we're going to review. So the first recommendation we have is to separate your log directory into an individual directory or on another partition altogether. And we recommend doing this and having your log directory outside of your working directory. As you can see here, now my working directory or my log directory is no longer inside the working directory with all of my configurations, but it's sitting alongside. And we recommend this for two reasons. One, to reduce risk, and secondly, also to ease future maintenance. So for example, to reduce risk is so that you can add those additional security measures directly to the logs. For example, those OS level permissions and restrictions can limit access to that patient information. But then it also allows for easier backup and upgrades in the future. So for example, having your logs alongside your configuration and application files it'll become easier to install that new version of Iguana and then simply point the new version of Iguana to your existing logs and configurations to upgrade to the newer version. So it definitely makes for an easier upgrade, but also rollback process if you do need to revert to the old version of Iguana again. We also recommend that you don't keep your logs for more than you need to. So if you have large log sizes, anywhere from megabytes to gigabytes per day, keeping your logs for that maximum 60 days can lead to two things: a risk of running out of disk space, as well as it can impact your Iguana restart time, because each time Iguana starts up, it does need to conduct a log integrity check on all the logs in that log directory. So to determine a maximum log age for your organization, you can base this number around your technical requirements. So for example, the disk space you have available and your average daily log sizes, which Iguana does calculate for you in your log usage page. But you also want to consider your business needs. So for example, how long you need to store your log messages for either troubleshooting or just general data access needs. So if you typically only need to troubleshoot using messages from the most recent week, then you can archive your log messages that are older than those 7 days outside of the log directory before they're purged. And you also may want to change your default log purge time to whatever the quietest time of day is for you. For example, 1 or 2 a.m. Now, the default purge time is midnight, but every day at midnight, for example, Iguana will try to purge all of the daily log files that are older than that maximum daily log age. So if there are any unmarked errors or messages still in the queue for that particular daily log file or for any channel during that time, then Iguana won't be able to purge that entire daily log file. And if you are using that default log purge time of midnight, there may still be messages in the queue from that day, and Iguana won't be able to purge those logs. So if disk space is tight, then that extra daily log file could result in a full disk. And the last recommendation we have for your log configuration and maintenance is just to continually monitor your storage capacity. And you want to do this to make sure that Iguana can always read and write to that log directory. And as a rule of thumb, we like to recommend that for any of Iguana's hardware resources, including your CPU, memory, and disk space, you want to make sure that this does not exceed 60% to allow for potential spikes in processing, but also to make sure that Iguana is just performing optimally. So you can monitor this in a few different ways. You can use your dashboard and look at the server pane at the bottom of the dashboard, and that'll display hardware resource usage metrics like your CPU, memory, and disk space. But you can also automate this monitoring through the Monitor API that Iguana also has. And if you're using any external monitoring systems like a SolarWinds or Nagios, for example, you can have those systems automatically query the Monitor API for metrics like disk space to ensure that Iguana always has enough space to read and write to that log directory. But you can also do this inside of Iguana. So if you aren't using any external monitoring systems, you do have the option to use a translator, for example, to again query that Monitor API and maybe trigger a notification for when the disk space has reached a custom threshold, for example. And we're going to look at more at how Iguana plays a role in triggering different notifications in a bit. But for now, now that we know what the logs are and what information they provide, as well as how they're stored and maintained, we're going to look at a few day-to-day key logging workflows. But before we go on, I do want to remind everyone to, as soon as you have a question, put it in the Q&A box, because we do have Paul and Natalie answering questions live, and we want to make sure we get to everyone's questions before the end. So the first area the logs play a large role in is troubleshooting, specifically around error resolution and reprocessing of messages. And there may be hundreds of reasons why you need to resubmit messages through Iguana, but a couple examples are if you've received bad data. So maybe there was Iguana's upstream system has sent you bad data, or there was a processing error, and you require resubmitting all affected messages. There could have been an external system failure, or an application outside of Iguana failed to process a message that Iguana had sent, and it requires Iguana to resend and reprocess maybe one or several days worth of messages. Or there could be infrastructure changes. So for example, you're bringing a new system live and you need to backpopulate this system with historical data. Now, these are just a few examples of use cases, but we're going to be focusing on how you can trigger Iguana to reprocess messages for any situation like this. So the typical troubleshooting process is going to start with when you've either received that error on the dashboard, or you've received an email notification, or you're being notified by a downstream system that they haven't received a message or they were unable to process a particular message. But using the logs, you're able to go into that log entry in question and view all related entries. And once you're viewing all related entries for that particular message, Iguana is going to it's going to provide you that complete history of the log messages describing the events that occurred surrounding that particular message's processing and the evolution as it passes through Iguana. So this increased visibility is extremely useful for scenarios where you need to understand the events leading up to an error, or if that downstream system is reporting that they weren't able to process that message or receive that message. You're able to then successfully go back through the logs and view the logs to ensure that it was processed, or see where it ran into that error and why. So if it turns out that there is an error that needs to be addressed, once you have narrowed down the message that is the culprit and needs to be reprocessed and resubmitted, then there's a few different strategies. If depending on if you need to resubmit a single message, if you need to resubmit multiple messages, or if you want to skip processing messages altogether. When you need to resubmit a single message, you have a couple different options when you're viewing the message from directly in the logs. You can modify and resubmit this message. And to do this, Iguana enables you to just simply manually edit the message and correct that known bug, and then preview those changes in the bottom panel there to ensure that Iguana is able to either parse the message with your additions. And then you can also choose the channel that you want to resubmit your message to. You may choose the same channel to resubmit the message for Iguana to process, or you may want to forward this message to another channel to be processed. But if this error isn't something that you can look at right away and modify and resubmit, and it's more of an edge case, then you can also send it back to the translator as sample data. And that way you're able to work in the translator and add that additional processing logic and ensure that in the future, next time Iguana runs into this type of message, it's able to process this correctly without any channel interruptions or any manual intervention. And once you have included that new logic, you can resubmit the message to be processed, and Iguana will be able to handle that on its own. Now, for those scenarios when you have multiple affected messages and you may need to resubmit multiple messages from the past, for example, you can reposition a channel's queue to restart processing from a specific point in time. So if you go into your Iguana logs page and select the log type message as well as a specific source channel that you want to reposition, all of the Iguana logs will then show as either processed or pending. These pending messages are just going to be queued messages that haven't been processed yet. And depending on if you know exactly where you want to start your reposition, you can either use the last processed message button underneath the source channel, and Iguana will bring you to the last successfully processed message as a point to reposition your queue. But if you know exactly where you want to start at a particular message, for example, you can also search through the logs and locate that specific point to reposition your queue. But once you know exactly where you want to start, you can click on that messages processed button, and a window will pop up to let you choose if you want to reposition the channel queue and either start here, meaning you'll resubmit messages from this point onwards, including this particular message. So for example, if you would use the start here if you know that this was the first improperly processed message. But you also have the option to select after this message, where Iguana will resubmit messages from this point onwards, but it will exclude the current message. For example, if you knew this was the last properly processed message. But lastly, there's also some times when you may need to skip processing. For example, for one or more queued or pending messages. So this may be when messages were sent in error and you don't want to process them. The messages Iguana received contain invalid data, or the messages contain errors and are actually stopping your channel and affecting processing of other messages. So the process to skip messages is almost identical to the process for resubmitting multiple messages. The only difference is that you select a pending message to restart from. So you can also reposition a channel's queue to omit the processing from a specific point in time by selecting that a pending message to restart from. Once you select that pending message, all of the pending messages prior to this point are going to be marked as processed. So then you'll see Iguana will be able to then, because they're marked as processed, skip those messages, and they'll no longer be in the queue for that specific channel. So we can really see how critical the logs are in troubleshooting and reprocessing messages and error resolution in general in Iguana. But they also play a large role in monitoring your Iguana interfaces and your instance, because they contain such a variety and a vast array of information about your Iguana instance, the interfaces, their health and status, as well as all processing activity. So the email and SMS notifications in Iguana are tightly coupled with the logs because they contain key phrases and words in those logs to trigger alerts that you create. My second example here is an example of when a customer would use a default informational or error log to automate monitoring different types of activities. So for example, the default informational log for a channel has stopped can be used just to monitor the status of all of your channels, as well as we see customers using informational logs that state failed login attempts to make sure that they know about any time there was a failed login attempt on the Iguana instance, just to make sure that all of that is recorded and documented as well. But these email notifications are really about using that information in the logs to help ensure that you are notifying the right people at the right time to mitigate issues that are occurring right now, but also avoid any further adverse events. But you can go beyond this and extend and customize your notifications and not use only the standardized log messages that Iguana produces by default. You can also create custom log statements using the Iguana log functions in your translator script. So using Iguana log info, warning, error, debug in your translator scripts, you can log a custom output and provide either additional insight with troubleshooting or raise a particular error. And these will act as a hook for triggering any notifications that you create. So you can see here in the example that I'm looking in each of my HL7 messages to see if a particular field is missing. And in that event, I'm going to log an error message saying alert, missing receiving facility. And in this first email notification example, in the image, you can see that I'm monitoring a specific channel for any error message that matches the keyword alert. So anytime I am processing an HL7 message that is missing that receiving facility, I'm automatically going to log that error in the logs, and Iguana is going to pick up that in its email notifications and alert my admin team that this message wasn't able to be processed correctly because it's missing information. And you can use these custom outputs for different types of activities, depending on what type of information you want to provide to your team. So for example, Iguana log error is great for monitoring issues with external systems or databases, to raise errors that are more urgent that your team needs to be aware of immediately. Whereas for not yet critical errors, you may want to use the warning logs to trigger notifications and monitor Iguana metrics like your channel queue depth or hardware resource usage, just to ensure that Iguana is healthy, performing optimally, and is able to handle any potential spikes in processing. But you can also use the debug log messages throughout your translator script and provide more granular views when you're doing things like testing or debugging any channel operation or channel performance. So these custom log statements really enhance the way that you can use your notifications throughout Iguana, as well as provide you additional insight while you're actually troubleshooting maybe an interface's performance. And if you're interested in hearing more about the Iguana log statements and how these can add value to your troubleshooting experience, I do recommend that you check out our last Iguana webinar, Foundations of Lua, and Paul actually presented that one. It was back in December. You can find it on our interfaceware.com website under resources and webinars, and you'll find it there. The last key workflow I wanted to go over is something we briefly introduced when we looked at troubleshooting, but you're also able to search the logs to help with locating and verifying a particular message when you're troubleshooting any errors. But you can also use the logs to search through the logs for any reporting purposes or analytics. When you need to locate a particular message in your logs, you can search through the logs using keywords, phrases, or regex patterns. And you can filter these results by your channel or your channel source or the Iguana service. You can filter by date and time range, and as well by your log type, whether you're looking for particular message logs or error logs, for example. But if you find yourselves doing frequent or complex searches, then you can also bookmark these searches and create specific URLs for finding this search criteria. So we do have a lot of customers that have created wikis just full of bookmarks for their common searches, so they can retrieve these common results quickly. And as well, when you further your reporting process, you are able to also access these logs from other applications, for example, by exporting your search results. You can export these as an annotated text file or a CSV, where Iguana will export the log message itself, but also all of the additional information related to that log message. For example, its source, the time it was generated, and as well the type of log message it is. But you can also export your messages as one log message entry per line. And that's really going to essentially just export a single Iguana message. And that's what's used for when you need to, for example, resubmit your messages to Iguana using our HL7 simulator, or if you need to export just the messages themselves to an external system without any of the additional information about the actual log. And that brings me to another method of searching the logs, the log API. The log API is a very powerful tool that not all of our customers are aware of. It's one of Iguana's public RESTful APIs, so you can use to query an Iguana server and access all of its logs and extract that data. You can provide specific query parameters to specify what type of information you're looking for from those Iguana logs. And it will return a XML table of all of the matching log entries based on your specific parameters and their associated information. These results can be used in various ways, so either within Iguana or externally in a file, a system, or any database. So we're going to look at a few different examples of different use cases, but in general, like we've seen throughout this whole webinar so far, the logs do contain such a wide variety of important information and visibility into the activity of your instance and your interfaces. So there are so many different applications to where you can leverage this log API to aggregate this data, extract its insight, and make your data more actionable. So we're going to take a look at a couple here, and then as well as in Iguana, we'll be looking at one of those use cases in particular. But you can use the log API to automate reprocessing of your messages and minimize any manual intervention and any channel interruption. So for example, you could use the log API to aggregate your messages from a specific time period and then push these to a queue to be reprocessed. Or if you need to, for example, hold or quarantine a message until you've gathered all its information, then you can also hold this message and use its message ID through the log API to query for that specific message and then automatically submit it to be processed at a later time. You can also use the log API for querying those audit logs that we talked about earlier as well. And you can aggregate all of this ePHI user interaction information to monitor for any breaches within Iguana or detect any improper access. And again, help you meet those HIPAA compliance requirements. So the log API really lets you, although you can do this from searching through the logs, it really lets you automate the process for regularly reporting these audit logs, maybe to an external tracing system that will do the tracing if needed. You can also use the log API for custom monitoring and mining messages for insight to help with any reporting and analytics you're doing. So for example, you can use that log API to aggregate the logs and look for very specific messages or even specific message contents. For example, if you're looking at all of the HL7 messages that you processed in a day, you can then look at specifically the different types, whether it was an ADT or a DFT, and look at the volume of each type of message that you're processing that day. And you can do this all within Iguana and create regular reports, or you can export these to external analytics systems as well. The last example is actually what we're also going to be looking at inside of Iguana today, and that is to use Iguana for archiving your log messages and keeping your log sizes smaller. So for example, what we're going to be looking at today is you can use the log API to aggregate all of the HL7 messages from a particular channel from the previous hour, and then write those messages to a flat file. And this flat file can be used simply to just archive my messages in a local directory, or I can save them in a format so that they could be easily ingested by Iguana in the future if need be. But it is important whenever you're using the log API for any of these use cases or a use case that we haven't talked about today, you want to make sure that you're keeping in mind security and performance. Because like we've talked about, these log messages do contain sensitive patient information. So you want to be mindful of where you're exposing this information outside of Iguana, because it may defeat some of the security controls that we have in Iguana today and that you've set up on your operating system. But as well, you want to keep in mind Iguana's performance. So avoiding adding a higher load on the Iguana instance that's already taking care of your day-to-day integration tasks. So for example, to avoid adding a load on your Iguana instance, we recommend that you pull smaller amounts of data or smaller batches to avoid overloading Iguana, as it will try to satisfy both your API requests and your daily integration tasks. So I have a quick example screenshot of how to actually call the log API. And here I'm calling it in Iguana, but you can also call it in any external applications that you're using, for example, Postman. But you can call the log API by making a GET request to the API query endpoint, as well as providing your Iguana credentials and specific parameters to query on. And you'll notice that these parameters actually mirror what you saw in the search GUI. So we can, for example, filter and query on these specific parameters around the type of log message, whether it's a message or informational log or error, as well as the source of where that log originated, filtering by your date and time ranges. As well, you can filter by specific keywords or phrases that are found in those log messages. So for example, you can see VIP, and you can use all these different combinations of parameters to come up with very specific queries and get your specific results that you're looking for, depending on the use case. And this log API also returns that table where you can then parse the results and isolate these messages to be used for any of those use cases we discussed.
This is some really in-depth content, Aryn, so really appreciate it. I do want to just remind people that Natalie and Paul are available for Q&A, live Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to type out your questions and they'll get back to you very shortly.
Thanks, Prashant. That brings me to the end of the actual PowerPoint portion of the webinar, and we are going to now jump into Iguana and look at a few exercises. So we'll look at troubleshooting, submitting those messages and repositioning the queue, but we'll also take a look at a channel that is going to query that log API and retrieve log messages hourly for archiving. So I'm just going to switch over to my Iguana instance and we can take a look at those few exercises. All right, here we go. So now that I've opened up my Iguana, we can see I have two channels running here. I have my HL7 processor channel, and this is simply just receiving random ADT messages every 10 seconds and taking that message, parsing it, remapping it to a similar ADT format, and then writing it to a local directory. But we're not too concerned about what that channel is doing. The main star of today is this log API channel. And this is what we're going to be jumping into after we look at the troubleshooting exercise. But essentially, like I described in the archive example, this translator is simply calling the log API to aggregate all of the messages that were processed in my HL7 processor channel from the last hour. And then I'm going to massage those messages, clean them up, and archive them to a file in my local directory so that I can archive them, but also they're formatted in a way so that if I do need to have Iguana reprocess them, Iguana can easily ingest them. So before we look at that channel, let's take a look at a couple troubleshooting workflows. So when you either receive that email notification of an error, or you see this error on the dashboard, you can simply go into the error, and you're able to then first start with viewing all related entries. So that's what we looked at earlier, to just give you an overview of what occurred and what type of processing happened surrounding that error. And it's going to give you that insight into maybe the reason for the error itself, or some unusual activity that occurred before or after before or after the error was raised. So in this case, you'll most likely want to go back to your original message that triggered that error. And you can open up this message in Iguana, and again, you have those two options that we looked at in the PowerPoint. You can either use this message in the translator as sample data. So if this was something that I didn't know right away what the error was, and I want Iguana to handle it better in the future, then I could choose that option. But because I had such a detailed error message saying that my message was missing the receiving facility, I can simply modify and resubmit this message to be processed by my HL7 processor channel again. So like we saw, you can simply modify your message to include that missing receiving facility, or that known bug. And then you're able to also preview those changes in your in a parsed tree format, to see if then Iguana is going to be able to recognize that receiving facility is now included, and it will parse and process this message properly. Now, I want to resubmit this channel back to my HL7 processor, but you could choose another channel if you wanted to forward it to another location as well, or another channel's queue. But for now, I'm going to then click resubmit, and Iguana is going to resubmit the message and bring me back to this context view, or this view all related entries view. So we can see the original view we were looking at earlier, where we saw the original message and then the error occurred. But once we've sent this message to be reprocessed, Iguana will have a little reprocessed symbol or resubmitted symbol in the icon, and Iguana is then going to also provide informational log statements and success messages around its processing. And I can see exactly, and I can see that it was this time successfully processed by the translator and written to that local directory that I spoke about. But when you are, maybe that error, for example, affected more than one message, you do also have the option to reposition your queue and resubmit maybe multiple messages that were affected by that error. So before you reposition a queue, you do have to stop the channel that you want to reposition, and we can go into the Iguana logs and then follow those steps that we went through before. So I'm selecting my log type message and the source channel that I want to reposition. And then I'm able to now see, in this case, all of my messages were processed successfully, but if there was an error and any messages were still stuck in the queue and waiting to be processed, these would be marked as pending. But you can choose a point from the past to reposition your channel at, and we see this box here where I can start here and include this message in my reprocessing and in my reposition, or I could reposition the queue after this message and exclude it from being reprocessed. In this case, I will start here, and we can then we'll see that now, because my channel isn't running, these messages are now going to be pending and queued messages, and we'll actually be able to see this on the dashboard as well. Now I have 5 queued messages, and once I start my HL7 processor channel, we can see that queue going down back to 0 because those messages are now being processed by the channel. So if you do have any questions about any of those resubmitting a single message or multiple messages, let Paul and Natalie know. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go over the log API channel here to finish it off. So I'm going to enter the translator that is querying my log API, and I'm just going to walk through the 4 main activities that this channel is doing. The first component or the first task that's involved in this channel is calling that log API. So you can see in the annotation window here, I'm calling my log API in my local log query module. I'm simply calling the log API query endpoint using the net.http.get function, and I'm passing in my Iguana credentials as well as some parameters to search for specific log messages. So for example, I am looking at only the message types because I'm only interested in HL7, aggregating those HL7 messages so that I can archive them, as well as I'm only looking in this particular HL7 processor channel. So only the HL7 messages that have been processed by this channel and in between this time frame. So I'm only looking for messages that were processed between now, the current time, and the past hour. And once these are aggregated, I'm just returning the results as is to the rest of my main function to clean up those results and write them to my file. So we can, again, go through that annotation window back to my main function and look at step 2. So I'm using the xml.parse function then to parse my my log query results. And you can see in the annotation window here, my parsed results. Iguana is going to return a list of all of the messages that met my criteria, and then it's going to include the data itself or my HL7 message, but also all of the information about the particular log message, like its source, when it was generated, the type of message it was. And because I'm only interested in archiving the message itself or the data element in this XML, then I'm going to loop through each one of these message nodes here and grab just the data element that contains my HL7 message. And because I want to resubmit this, or because I want it to be able to be resubmitted in the future, I'm also going to clean up that HL7 message so that it has the proper HL7 end of line characters, and Iguana is able to then read it in the future easily. And again, to take a better look at what the message looked like originally when I isolated the HL7 message versus after cleaning it up and adding in those returns, I simply separated all of the segments onto their own line. And after the messages are cleaned up and ready to be written to my file, I'm simply going to define the directory and the daily log file, or the daily file that I want to use to hourly log any messages that were processed by the HL7 processor channel. And I'm going to open that file in append mode so that I can keep adding additional files or additional HL7 messages to that specific daily file until, of course, the next day where Iguana will generate a new file name based on the date and fill it all day with all the hourly logs that are produced by the HL7 processor channel. So if we switch over to my file directory here, we can see I have my Iguana installation directory with my 6.14 application files, my configurations or my working directories, and as well my log directory, all sitting alongside one another so that I'm both reducing that risk and I can add any OS level restrictions on my log directory, but I can also have an easier upgrade process in the future by just installing the newer version of Iguana alongside this and pointing to my working directory and logs. And we can see if I open up this working directory, I can see these daily archived files or these text files. And I can open one up and we'll see all of my HL7 messages have been added to this file in a way that in the future, if I need to, I can resubmit these to Iguana and Iguana can run through and process these messages again. So that does bring me to the end of the webinar. I hope everyone was able to either learn something new or take away some inspiration on how to use your logs to optimize your workflows or use that log API to automate some of your processes. And thank you again for taking the time to join today's webinar. We'll follow up with any questions that we didn't have time to answer, but I hope everyone's asking lots of questions throughout.
Thank you, Aryn. I certainly learned a lot during this webinar presentation, so I really appreciate that. That was very thorough and great presentation. All the questions, we had several questions come in, so really happy to see that. By any chance, if we didn't get back to you via a live Q&A response, we will email a response to you. So our team will certainly get back to you. It does look like we are running a bit out of time here, but our next webinar is going to be in the early summer, in early June or sometime in June. So please keep an eye out for that one. And as we conclude this webinar, there is going to be a quick survey. It's just going to take about 20 seconds, but your feedback is invaluable to us because we want to continue to improve our process, improve the content that we put out, and make sure that it is relevant content that we are presenting to you. So on behalf of all of us from INTERFACEWARE, we want to wish you the best and continue to stay safe. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us at marketing@interfaceware.com, and we certainly will make sure that the right response is provided to you. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.